AJ, are you ready to take us away here?
I am ready. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you great. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I will get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right.
I can see it. Looks good.
All right, wonderful. Just going to move this in to presentation mode. Okay, so yeah, I'll get started here. Again, thanks everybody so much for joining us here today. I'm pretty excited to talk about exploring innovation for better civic engagement in our local communities. So a little bit about me here at IdeaScale. So I work on the public sector team. Sometimes I feel like I've got one of the best roles here because all day long I'm talking to folks, just to folks like yourselves in government, just to ask them what some of their priorities are, some of their challenges, what's important to them, what they're working on in the innovation space. And then of course I see if there's any kind of fit that IdeaScale can help with. But it really gives me, I'm able to have kind of my thumb on the pulse for what people in government innovation, what folks are really focused on. So I'm based here in New York City, actually. If you hear a train rolling by, this office is right next to the commuter trail line. So what I want to really frame this webinar around is trust building. So we've all probably seen these numbers before. At some point, I know in my career, I've come up against them a few times. But in the 1960s, public trust, and this is according to Pew Research, in the 1960s, public trust in government was at 80%. Sounds great. Flash forward to the 2010s, public trust in government is below 20%. Wow. Not exactly great, but as I'll talk about here, not all hope is lost. So here's just like a couple quotes, and I think this kind of demonstrates why I think this is so important right now. First, many Americans think declining trust in government and in each other makes it harder to solve key problems. I think we all could probably agree to that. But I think something that that's even more startling, and something that I'll be talking about here a little bit later, the share of African Americans and Hispanics who show high levels of trust in government is half that of white Americans, which in 2020, of course, is a real problem. But there is hope, and that hope especially, there's especially hope for local. More than 8 in 10 Americans, according to Pew Research, believe it's possible to improve the level of confidence people have in the government. And drumroll, 86% believe local communities can be laboratories for trust building. All of you today here on the webinar, we can all, this is our domain, which is pretty exciting. So I just want to kind of touch on a couple things before I go into some of the trends that I've seen, that I've been hearing about, that can help build more trust in local government, because they're pretty evident in a lot of these trends just from looking at these 5 elements of a strong democracy. So this is from the University of Pennsylvania. 3 of these things are going to be very important to what we're talking about today. The first is having empowered citizens, where people are the principal actors in a democracy. The next, I'm sure this is something that if you're in the innovation space, this is kind of at the forefront of the work you're doing, but information and communication, that's important in a strong democracy. And then social cohesion, having a shared sense of purpose and identity. So I'm going to roll right into some of the trends that I've been hearing about, that I've been reading about. And a lot of them you'll see, they factor into some of those pillars we were just talking about. So there's a list that I was reading according to Gartner, 10 trends to look for in 2020 and beyond. We see a lot of things we've probably all heard a little bit about, or maybe we know a lot about. Security is right at the top of the list. Multi-channel citizen engagement, something I'm going to talk about next. Anything as a service, XAAS, instead of SaaS. And then, of course, analytics, having a digitally empowered workforce. These are the things that Gartner's predicting are going to be very important as we look to 2020 and beyond. And let me just start with multi-channel citizen engagement, because multi-channel engagement is something I hear almost every day from folks. You know, we're more than just, you know, stopping by. People don't stop by in person in government anymore. People don't rely just on email. People don't, you know, send in paper mail. And these are things that I think we've all heard about in this point by 2020. That it's important to be on multiple channels, social media, email, things of that nature. You know, just thinking about all the ways we interact with others. You know, now we in our homes, we've got smart speakers that we can ask to, you know, send messages for us. You know, there's so many, communication is changing so quickly that there's just a myriad of different ways that we can interact with government. And so I think that we know that. I think this audience, especially if you're in the innovation space, we know that we should be interacting with folks on multiple different levels. Something that I think is very cool that I've been hearing a lot about is using these multiple channels to reach marginalized communities. So that means reaching, you know, low-income communities, diverse communities, communities where English isn't their primary language. Some very cool things are being done to make sure those folks who historically haven't been able to be a part of the conversation, they have their voices heard. And it's something that folks, I find when I'm speaking with folks, they're very interested in figuring out how can they do that. So here's one story that I put up here, and it actually has to do with SMS texting. So SMS texting is a super effective way to communicate with low-income communities, because these are often communities who don't live and die by email like you or I might. What Anchorage, Alaska actually did is their innovation team, they created an SMS solution to make it easier for low-income communities to get their SNAP benefits. So SNAP benefits, those are programs to help low-income Americans put food on the table. But often for these communities, going in person to these government offices, it's tough. There's a lot. It's just very tough to carve out that time when you are, you know, worrying about, you know, maybe you've got 2 jobs, maybe you've got a lot of other things, a lot of family issues going on. So what the innovation team for Anchorage did, they just did a very simple, somebody takes SNAP, and then they get an automatic response back. It says, how can we help? And by exchanging these messages, the system then schedules appointments. They can begin a benefits application. And that's important because that's a channel that those communities are on. And I hear about SMS a lot. And here's 3 quick examples about cities who are using SMS to reach different types of communities. Detroit using it to help families determine eligibility for early childhood subsidies. In terms of accessibility, New York City actually using an SMS for texting 911 to deaf residents. Durham, North Carolina, helping residents expunge their criminal records. As soon as they started this program, within a couple of weeks, they had gotten like 2,500 texts. So SMS really, it's not just for emergencies or weather alerts. It's an innovative way to reach a lot of these communities that we haven't been able to hear too much from in the past. And then there's the other simple channels too. When we talk, I think a big fear that folks have when I talk with them on the phone is, you know, when folks talk about multi-channel communication, oftentimes they jump to, oh, we need to immediately roll out all these channels. We need to invest in X, Y, and Z. But there are a lot of things that you can do right now that folks are already doing with these communication channels that are pretty innovative. So one example, the East Moline Police Department. This is something that I thought was really cool and something I've actually seen on my own social media channels in the past for like Crime Stoppers, when the police department wants the public's help in Maybe there's a criminal they're trying to find. They'll, historically what it would be news outlets or flyers or things like that. But now Crime Stoppers is, you might see your police department sharing a post asking for community feedback, community help on catching a criminal or something like that. And folks will comment, oh, I've got X information, or they'll direct message or something like that. For East Moline, when they started doing this in 2018, in 2017, they had, I think, about 800 tips that came in for crimes after they implemented the social media crowdsourcing. And this is something crowdsourcing we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. They actually saw those numbers double. So it's just reaching people on the channels where they reside, which I think is very cool. Another thing here, something that's very easy that I think is cool that people are starting to do, is actually kind of having a forums 2.0 when you think about the way that government communicates with residents. Another big fear that I hear a lot from people who want to communicate with residents and want residents to communicate with them is when we think about just like a comment section on a website, we think of a lot of vitriol. We think of personal attacks. It's easy when you're sitting behind a keyboard to maybe not be quite as filtered as you should be. Something I thought that was kind of interesting that in Reykjavik, Iceland, they started doing on some of their forums, instead of just leaving a comment section open where they've got to have somebody moderating it to remove all of these sometimes hateful messages, is actually require residents to list arguments for and against a proposal that they have. So yes, that kind of makes their engagement go down. They aren't having as many people who are using that communications channel, but what they lack in engagement, they certainly make up for in substantive discussion on a lot of these city proposals, which I think is something that everybody here would probably prefer for their local governments as well. And then some more advanced things, but definitely still trending, things that I've been reading a lot about, but I haven't necessarily been hearing a lot about. Mobile voting, you might have heard of this. One example in King County, Washington, they're getting ready to have an upcoming election. It's a very small election. It's for a conservation district, but it's an ideal test to see if they can record these votes online in a secure manner. And then something else too, which if you are in a bigger city, maybe you might have seen interactive kiosks. We're reading a lot about this right now. That will probably continue through the future. It's a way to provide people with free Wi-Fi, suggestions for shopping and dining. Folks don't have to go in person to a government office. Those are obviously very expensive routes. So obviously not everybody's looking to put one of those in their community of maybe 30,000 people. But another thing that's interesting that cities are using it for is help finding a shelter bed for homeless populations. So I was talking about earlier, low-income communities, they'll rely on maybe SMS as a way to communicate. Homeless populations, they wouldn't even have something like that. So this is a way that is a little bit innovative that people would be able to interact with government. So the next thing here, and if you'll remember that top 10 thing list that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, security was a big deal. Obviously, it's something that we're all pretty concerned about, especially in light of a lot of the recent ransomware attacks that we've seen. Places like Baltimore that have just had to dump millions of dollars into remedying the problems caused by something like a ransomware attack. And there's a lot to be worried about upcoming here. So election security, targeted ransomware, like I just mentioned, where hackers take control of the city's systems, and unless the cities pay money to the hackers, they won't release any of those systems. Ways to attack the cloud. Obviously, people cities and local governments are moving towards cloud-based technologies. So hackers are trying to find ways to attack the cloud. Deep fake technology, and then Internet of Things exploitation, which I know I mentioned earlier a little bit about smart speakers and things of that nature. So although this is a concern I'm sure we all have, a lot of people, they wonder, what could I possibly do to prevent like a ransomware attack. This is going to cost me so much money. This is I mean, we can't make these third-party IT security teams pop out of thin air. But what I've been hearing from a lot of the city leaders that I'm talking to is actually making a focus on people. Now, of course, this isn't going to be the entirety of the solution, but it sure is a good starting point. So especially with ransomware, making sure staff is well trained and engaged so they know how to take action. I mentioned a few different cities that had been targeted by these attacks. Other cities have kind of learning from why that's happened, and a lot of times it's because a city employee clicked on something that took them to a malicious website or something of that nature. So actually, in New York City, they did a simulation of a ransomware attack for their employees, so that they would know how to act if some kind of ransomware attack were to happen. So making sure staff knows what to do. I've been hearing a lot of focus on retaining tech talent, building a culture. If anybody here is in the chief information office or something like that, probably how hard it is sometimes to retain and build that tech culture. So that's also something people are focused on. And then finally, leverage ideas of current staff. Everybody's got a lot of brain power on their teams. Something we help with here at IdeaScale, actually. But leveraging ideas from staff on how can we fix some of these vulnerabilities in our systems. And then other trends that I've been reading about, again, haven't always been hearing about, that are gaining traction. First, having a secure digital identity. A lot of cities and counties are interested in something like this, especially as they move to something like a digital government, where folks can apply for a permit, they can buy a bus pass, they can pay their taxes all in one place. That obviously requires a lot of personal information, and so cities are moving towards ways to make sure that information is secure through secure digital identity. And then multi-factor authentication. I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot about that, but and a statistic I think is interesting. And for those of you who don't know what multi-factor authentication is, that's like when you put in your password, you also get a text message. So you have to verify that it's actually you through your cell phone. And so it's a very simple way to cut down on weak passwords. And then 80% of data breaches are the result of weak or stolen passwords, which I think is amazing. And maybe a lot of you will remember a few years ago, OPM had a data breach that compromised like 50 million pieces of information. And then finally, something that I hear about a ton that we help with here at IdeaScale, which I'll go into a little bit, is building a two-way conversation with residents. Remember, we go back to the pillars of a strong democracy. Having an empowered citizenry obviously is very important. People don't want to be talked at; they want to have a conversation. And we talk a lot about, especially in the innovation space, we talk about GovTech and Civic Tech. A lot of times, GovTech is what we talk about when we talk about efficiency, and Civic Tech is what we talk about when we talk about engagement. And so this part, where maybe I've been talking a little bit about GovTech stuff, this part I'm just going to talk a little bit about some Civic Tech solutions, specifically here at IdeaScale that we help with. But first, before I do that, I just want to share a story that some of you might have heard about. It's France and the Great National Debate. So the Yellow Vest protests, maybe some of you will remember that, that happened about a year ago, where people in France were a little bit upset with their government, and there was a bit of disquiet on the streets. And so the government decided, okay, we want to hear from people. We want to know what your concerns are. So they used a combination of in-person exchanges, online surveys, multiple choice questionnaires, open-ended responses. They wanted to know, what these folks, what citizens were, what their concerns were. And over 1 million people participated, which is great, or at least it sounds great, right? Well, I think there's a quote here that I was reading from France 24 that I think this kind of sums up some of the perils of something like that, something I hear all the time. If the people who have participated don't see anything concrete come out of this, they will feel duped and tricked, according to one French official, which isn't good, and is a concern that, like I said, I hear a lot. We want to engage our residents. We want to know what's important to folks, what's on the minds of the people that we serve. But getting that information is one thing. Taking action on it is another thing. You don't want to have all these suggestions just kind of languishing away, because then it becomes a waste of time for everybody. So it's like, why did I submit these pieces of feedback? Why did I fill out these surveys? Why did I go, to the mayor's office or what have you, if you weren't going to do anything with it? So a question I hear a lot from people I speak to, how do cities take action on the feedback that they receive, especially when we're living in a time of limited budgets and limited staff? There's a lot of different creative ways that I've seen government taking away on some of this feedback. But what I want to talk about actually is crowdsourcing for a lot of this feedback. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of crowdsourcing in government, which is something that we work with here at IdeaScale, this is kind of how it works with what we do. So first, an individual shares an idea, which is great, which is what France is doing, which is probably what a lot of communities are wanting to have happen. But what makes crowdsourcing a little bit different is that the community actually offers feedback through comments with us specifically at IdeaScale. They can vote on ideas that they find important to kind of refine and prioritize different ideas. Cities can put out challenges to their residents on specific issues. And that takes a little bit of the burden off of a lot of these city leaders who have small budgets and not a lot of staff. When they see all these ideas that have been voted up and down, the leaders are then much more easily able to evaluate these ideas and take action, actually do something with the ideas that folks have submitted to them. And of course, teams can prototype and test and deliver. And so with IdeaScale, when I'm talking about folks, the IdeaScale system, got a good quote here for what it is we actually do. So it's a scalable system where ideas can be captured, connected, developed, and thrive. And that last part, developed and thrive, is the important point. And so like the IdeaScale process, what we do to help communities take action on a lot of the feedback they give, first, an individual shares an idea with a community leader. Right here, you've got a campaign for an annual challenge. And then from that, the community offers feedback. Those ideas are able to develop within an office once somebody has shared that idea. And then once you're able to see and kind of quantify what ideas are most popular in your community, what's important to folks, leadership is able to evaluate and prioritize those ideas. And then obviously, once those ideas have been prioritized, then teams go ahead and they can prototype. They can actually deliver on some of the suggestions that folks have had. So we work with a ton of people here at IdeaScale. They're all right there. I know in government specifically, we worked at the White House, worked with the U.S. military. We worked with cities, counties, and states all across the country. We do work in Canada. We work in South Africa. We have a global presence, and a lot of our work in government. We have a big footprint in Australia. And so here's something that I think is pretty cool for some of the work we've done with Western Australia Police through IdeaScale. They were able to get an idea for a legislative change for a detention policy that ended up saving 46,000 hours each year. which I think is tremendous. I think we all at our offices would love to have that much more time to do other things for the people that we serve. Obviously, this, every 46,000 hours is, it could be a lot or it could be a little, depending on the size of your city or your county. But I think it's pretty cool to see what one idea can do to free up time when we're talking about limited staff. And then here's something for the TRB that we did. We were able to help them select 26 new research projects that actually were able to receive $9 million in funding. And then something cool that IdeaScale does, or a pretty cool statistic here that I like, is IdeaScale data shows that every crowd member has an estimated value of almost $1,200 in untapped ideas. So that's nearly $1.3 million for every 1,000 people, which a lot of folks that I'm speaking to, obviously saving money is something that they're very interested in doing. Efficiency is very important to a lot of people. And when you're able to kind of crowdsource out some of those challenges you're having for efficiency, it tends to be pretty powerful. So I'll end right there. And I think there are there are going to be a few minutes for question and answer. But thanks everybody for joining me today, and glad to take any questions.
Thank you, AJ. It's really interesting stuff that the people are doing. In fact, we did have a few questions even while you were talking about different types of technology that cities are using. One of our questions was about multimedia messaging services. So sending more than just SMS, sending audio and video. Did you read about some other kind of technology testing that they're doing in that space?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely, a lot of times I'm speaking with folks who are kind of at the beginning stages. So just kind of like getting a text out is kind of step one. But I know there's an example in North Carolina of, I think it was not Durham. I think anyway, it was a county government who wanted to renew a registration, and they needed certain documents from folks to renew that registration, and they were able to make it so that folks could actually take picture messages of certain documents to send in.
Oh, that's cool.
Rather than like going to a library or having to scan a bunch of documents, which nobody likes to deal with scanners.
And we were also talking, there was some other discussion of like this multi-level authentication. Like somebody asked, do you know of any transit systems that are authenticating purchasers of bus passes? I don't. But one of the reasons, of course, is that sometimes that authentication process impedes access to things like bus passes. But several do use other methods of multi-level authentication. Have you heard some of these other methods of multi-level authentication?
So I think first, when we're talking about multi-factor authentication, I think a big fear that a lot of people have is that it's going to prevent folks from being able to interact with their services. But the trend is that not just government, but everywhere is kind of moving towards multi-factor authentication. When I log in with my bank, I've got to send a text message. Actually, if you work in the federal space, I don't know if there are any federal folks joining us today, but federal agencies are actually going to be mandated to use multi-factor authentication. Well, they already are mandated, but they're moving towards it to use multi-factor authentication. So that's definitely the direction that the wind is blowing. So I always encourage folks, if they're thinking about it, to actually do that. I don't think there are any examples of other ways. I mean, there's like a PIV card where a lot of larger cities will have, when somebody enters their password, they'll have an actual identification badge that somebody has to insert in their computer in order to be authenticated. But for the most part, multi-factor authentication is a text message code or a phone call that folks get.
We had a question here about QR codes. Are they a successful way to get prospective participants to a challenge page or a registration page?
Well, I would like to think so, yes. I haven't necessarily seen any statistics on this, but just yesterday, I actually, New York City Transit, they've got like they have a QR code that you can scan pretty quickly to get New York City Transit map on your phone. I just did that yesterday. I love things like that. So I see those around, especially when it comes to transit a lot, where people are busy or on the move. So I would like to think that that is something that's popular, but I think what it really comes down to, again, what we were talking about with communication is the channels that people are on. So the example I just gave about being down in the New York City subway, I'm on the move, I'm going quick. If I can scan something real quick, I'm going to do that, because those are the types of people who are getting on and off the subway. So if you feel like you're in that kind of environment, it's probably super effective. But if you are putting a QR code, a bus stop in a small town with very few people actually use it, you're of course going to have not as great results. So I think it probably just depends on if that's a channel that that residents are using to engage the government.
I was going to say, I don't have any data to back this up myself either, but ever since they changed so that you don't have to use an app to download, to scan a QR code, you can just do it from the photo app. I've seen so many more of our customers doing that as a way to get people, engaged, especially when they're doing in-person engagement tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ease of use and barriers to entry for different types of technologies, I think it's a real thing that a lot of people in the innovation space spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to do. It's just like the question that we had with multi-factor authentication. Is this going to prevent folks from actually engaging with the government? I think that there's a fear that if we put so many layers in front of folks, they're just not going to do something, which to some extent is true. So I think with codes like this, making it as easy as possible to get this information to people is something I'm seeing a lot of innovation teams working on.
We had a question here too about language. So one of the things when you enter an IdeaScale community is that you have the registration page. Have we had any customers change it to be something other than registration, because that might deter community members from having an account, since some might be here illegally or have concerns about ICE and other agencies?
Jessica, actually, I'm not sure. You might actually have more of an insight into this than I do, kind of on our marketing end of things. But I think people are very concerned about the types of language that they use when they're interacting with people in their communities. They don't want to alienate anybody, especially marginalized communities that are trying to get into the fold by the way that they're using their messaging. I don't know, if you have anything to add to that, Jessica?
I don't have it. I mean, specifically the word registration, I haven't heard people talk about that. But I will say that that's one of the things that people change all the time in our community.
Mm-hmm.
Like just the language itself, maybe they don't want to call it ideas. Maybe they want to call it, opportunities or inspiration fragments. People will change the language sometimes. But I think your point about, there are many communities that we want to involve, especially in these community engagement tactics. So considering the language should be pretty important. I know when the New York City Police used IdeaScale, one of the biggest things that was important to them was not so much the words themselves, so much as providing the community in multiple languages, and then all of their promotions were done in multiple languages as well. Certainly, I think Chinese was one of them. They had a Spanish translation, and it was all about what you were talking about, finding different ways to speak to the people that they wanted to hear from. We had a question here about time range, like how long should a challenge run?
Yeah.
Do you have any like research on that?
Not specifically. You know, again, when I'm interacting with folks, it's generally it's kind of a top level conversation, rather more than having a tactical conversation. So I wouldn't be the best person to have statistics on what works best for a challenge. Um,
I just had a clarification on that question, which is how long does it take to get started on a challenge?
Yeah, you know, again, like I think that I think it really just depends on the priorities of the organization and what their timeline they're working on is. You know, in idea scale in the platform, it's really not hard to get a challenge out to a community. So it's, you know, it's really as long as you feel would be best served for that challenge.
I think that one of the examples even that you showed with the Western Australia Police, the reason that they decided to use our platform was because they were able to prototype it and launch it in a day. So it can be that short. But like you pointed to at the beginning of the webinar, the things that are very disengaging are challenges which no planning is done to actually implement ideas or respond to people's feedback. So some people need to take a little bit longer to actually strategize around what type of process will work for them, how they're going to kind of plan to have some resources available to respond to what's most important. And that can take a little bit longer, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, government, something that we all realize within government is government, you know, we oftentimes work on such different timelines than other industries do. So I was speaking with an organization last week who are actually court ordered to get changes done by a certain month. And so obviously, and a month coming up pretty quickly. So obviously they want to get, you know, they want to have they want to get those challenges out there quickly. They want things to move pretty quick, but not everybody needs to be on that expedited of a timeline.
Right. I don't have any other questions here from the audience necessarily. I did have one other question. Is there a particular that I just had personally, because you're talking to the people about, you know, what problems they want to solve. Is there any subject matter that people particularly want to ask their community about? Any challenges or problems that they're having that they think the crowd is particularly well suited to answer for them?
Yeah, I think too, that's a great question. And I think too, which is one of the reasons why I started off this presentation talking about communities where folks, where they're trying to get in touch with folks who are a bit marginalized, is I'm always amazed by, you know, how much these public servants want to get in touch with these types of communities. So I'm always hearing things about, you know, how can how can an underserved community that lives in this part of our city, how can we engage with them? I don't speak their language, you know, what can be done? You know, of course, with Idea Scale, we've got a solution for that where we can do real-time translation. But, you know, folks are across the board, when they're looking at community engagement, you know, they want to get everybody's voices involved. I don't think I've ever talked to somebody and they've just been like, yeah, we want to just engage a small part of our community. They want to get everyone involved. So I think I hear a lot about folks who are trying to be more inclusive in the way they engage with their communities.
Well, that's a positive problem to solve, finding more ways to be inclusive.
Absolutely.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we'll wrap it up for today. Again, this recording will be available afterwards to those who want to share it or view it on their own time. And thank you so much for taking the time to put this presentation together, AJ.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining again. If you have any questions, reach out to Jessica or myself. And thank you all so much.
Have a great day. Thanks.